Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone who is on the line. I will be introducing Brett here shortly, but I just want to introduce myself. I'm Carl Weckerly. I'm the director of Michigan Colleges Online, which is part of Michigan Community College Association, working with all the community colleges across the state of Michigan. I'm really excited to have you all here today and excited to introduce our first speaker, which is Brett Griffiths, the director of Reading and Writing Studios. So with that, get out of your way and take it from there, Brett.
Thank you, Carl. I know yours and my conversation about PowerNotes started last year when you were at Macomb before joining Michigan Colleges Online, and I'm glad that you've decided to sort of bring that and expand that conversation. I do want to take care of a couple pieces of housekeeping as people are still coming in. The first is that we are recording this, and we're recording it so that people can access the video, share it with colleagues, or if you have to step out for a minute and come back, you can still have access to that information. Obviously, if you're uncomfortable being recorded, you are welcome to turn off your camera or do whatever you need to do to feel the most comfortable. And then the second is we're a small group, so everyone has been muted upon coming in. And as we work through some of the things we're going to present up front, we do ask that you submit questions via chat, and we'll try to facilitate and get those advanced to the speakers in a timely fashion. But then at the end, we do have some time for Q&A, so feel free to raise your hands or unmute and ask questions towards the end. We do hope to have a lively discussion. Okay, so by way of quick introductions, I know introductions sometimes seem to take the most time out of these events, so I'll try to be brief, but I want everyone to have an understanding of the different players in this conversation because we're all coming from slightly different positions, and I think that might help you all to think about where you want to address your questions and where you want to bring your own critical eye to this conversation, because it's a conversation about teaching, but it's also a conversation about software, and I think it's always good to bring a critical eye to those conversations. My name is Brett Griffiths. As Carl said, I'm the director of the Reading and Writing Studios, which is a position I've had for the last 5 years. Prior to that, I taught full-time at Muskegon. I know that there's a couple of Muskegon colleagues joining us today. I've also taught full-time as a lecturer at Southern Illinois University, and then I've popped around at University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan. So prior to running a writing center, I was also teaching in the classroom for about 14 years. Joining me today, I'll be having a conversation with Wilson Su, who is the CEO and founder of PowerNotes. And he's going to talk a little bit about his own background when we have our conversation. He'll be talking about his background as a student writer and also what led him to start PowerNotes. Also joining us today are Carolyn Pickrell and Leah Bublitz. Carolyn teaches first and second year writing at California State University, Sacramento. Also has experience teaching at, you'll have to tell me if I got this wrong, Carolyn, but I think it's Los Rios Community College. So also has a lot of experience sort of helping students navigate that transition to college writing, especially in the first and second year environment. And Leah works with me. She's a coordinator of one of our campus sites for the Reading and Writing Studios. She holds an MFA from Georgia College, and one of her stakes in this conversation is helping students navigate their own comfort with writing on a one-on-one level. Jimmy Fleming and Karen Bieber are also joining us. They are both employees for PowerNotes. Jimmy Fleming's background is in publishing and first-year composition textbooks. And Karen's background is with PowerNotes, but also with assessment. In fact, Karen's currently working with Kent State University to do some assessment of how PowerNotes informs learning in the classroom and some of those conversations. So that might help you think about where to direct questions that way. Our plan today for today's schedule goes a little bit differently than I think the advertising said. So I'm going to start where Wilson and I will just have sort of an open, I hope, friendly conversation. And then we'll move it. Carolyn will talk about how she uses PowerNotes in her first year writing classroom, specifically how she uses the share feature in PowerNotes to be able to help and scaffold the research and reading process for students all the way to their writing paper, and also how she uses it for teaching rhetorical analysis. And then Leah will close talking about some of the ways that she uses it to help students see and value their own writing and their own thoughts. Okay, so Wilson, you know this story, but I'll share with our group. I first learned about PowerNotes last summer, about this time. I was at the Writing Program Administrators Conference in Baltimore, Maryland last summer. And as you all know, there are opportunities for lunches where other people pay and you get to eat. And I came in and I made a salad, and I don't know, I've been to enough conferences that I usually know better, but I somehow found myself sitting right up front at a table, and I looked up and there's the podium with the sponsored speaker. And I thought, how many years have you been doing this, Griffiths, and you don't know not to go sit in front at a sponsored lunch? Come on now. So I grabbed my phone and I got my Candy Crush ready so I could be truly prepared to not pay attention to this speaker. I am often reluctant when it comes to ed tech, if that has not come across. That's my point. I'm very reluctant because I've had ed tech people come to me and say, wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to give students feedback? And I think, no, that would change my job from teaching and tutoring to data entry. And that is not interesting to me. I don't want that job. And so I really sat down with the intention to critique, maybe heckle Wilson a little bit, given my proximity. But what happened was he started showing ways that students could add fundamentally sticky notes to the web pages as they were reading them. And then they could bring those digital sticky notes with them. They could slide and drag and move those into outlines. And then the aha moment for me really came when he said, look, with one click, I can now export all these sticky notes I've taken across 12 pages into a document. And I looked at the document and I thought, for my students, that document is proof of work. For my students, that's an early outline. And I don't know about all of your students, but I know that the students that I work with in the studios are very similar to the students that Rebecca Cox talks about in her book, The Fear Factor. Many of them are afraid of writing. Many of them have received so much criticism that they literally shake as they're trying to write on the page. And they will come to me and they'll say, I know I got it wrong. My outline's wrong because I didn't use the right Roman numerals, or my MLA is wrong because I can't remember where to put the parentheses. And I keep trying to reinforce for them that, no, we're interested in what you have to say, what you read, what you think, how your learning is developing. And they say, well, nobody cares about that. It's just this MLA thing. And what I saw when Wilson started talking was that it made that invisible process that students think doesn't matter really visible. Wilson, would you be willing to sort of talk about your own experiences as a student and maybe show some of those features that you highlighted in Baltimore?
Yeah, thank you, Brett. So PowerNotes really came about because of my own personal experience with research and writing. I think, I was one of those scared students. In undergrad, I didn't go to community college, but I was an engineer. And so, as engineers go, from a reading and writing perspective, we don't like either one of those things. And so while I did have to learn how to do research as an undergrad, this was in the early 90s and everything was done in print. And a lot of the processes that come along with research and writing, I learned from my professors and also my high school teachers. Things like transcribing things onto note cards, using those note cards to move around information to reorganize it. And that was a process that I learned. I kind of gravitated towards. I got used to it. And then I graduated. I practiced as an engineer for several years. And then when I went back to grad school, I went to law school. And that's when the real fear came in. And it was a real fear because, I had done the minimum amount of research and writing in undergrad, and law school is like 95% research and writing. And so for me, getting into the actual content was one thing, but what I discovered is, this was the mid-2000s, all of the content that I was going through, all of my sources were now digital. And so that was a new challenge for me that introduced a whole nother set of processes, a lot of processes that I had to kind of reinvent my process for doing research and writing, because all of that kind of paper-based research and writing processes, they kind of went away. They weren't that relevant anymore. And I found that a lot of these processes weren't necessarily taught to me. I had to figure them out on my own. And there was a lot of mental overhead, like the MLA stuff, like formatting. How do you copy and paste and save stuff? Like I ended up copying and pasting. I hated that process. It caused me to constantly leave my source, so that I had to, save whatever information in another document. That led me to kind of pause my reading every single time I wanted to save something. And worse, I think the worst part of it was that as I dumped stuff into that other document, it was then very difficult for me to reorganize and organize that document, which led to more disorganized writing. And so I felt like the process itself hurt my eventual writing. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was use my technology background to really not try to change how people teach writing necessarily, but really try to make those little mechanical process steps a lot easier, and make them flow from one to the next so that research and writing aren't so disjointed in my mind. And so I'm just gonna share my screen real quick, just to show you, just one quick feature where we're basically eliminating copy and paste from the process, because that's something I really didn't enjoy. So normally I would have to copy and paste something that I wanted to save here into another document if I were going to use it for later. Right now with PowerNotes installed, all I have to do is highlight it, and then this box is going to pop up. What it's going to do is it's going to prompt you to organize what you just highlighted, then annotate it. And then once you've done that, you can just continue reading. So again, you never have to leave your source. We wanted to really focus students much more on their sources. We'll save the information that they highlight here on the right side. The information that's highlighted in quotation marks, their notes are always in a separate field. We automatically save a link back to the source. And it's all going to be filed under the topic that they chose, in this case, background. So that's just one example of how we're going to kind of facilitate the mechanical steps while still allowing the students to really focus and learn more with the content itself. So I'm gonna stop there and let you continue.
Thank you. Yes, that's helpful. So one of the things that I had mentioned to you was really powerful to me was this export feature. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday in preparation for today. But as I was watching you use it again, the other thing I was reminded is how useful it is for an annotation feature.
Yep.
In the reading and writing studios, we're not only teaching writing, but often we're teaching annotation, sometimes on the page. But the research shows that a lot of students haven't learned to annotate on the page. And then they are trying to learn to annotate in a digital space without a format for that. So PowerNotes really offers that up in many ways. And then the other thing I was sort of thinking is, and I'm going back to my notes here just for a moment, forgive me, is making that visible. So I believe, I don't know if I shared it with you. I know I've shared it with some other people that we're talking with today, but it's fairly common. It's actually quite common for students to come into the studios and say, I've finished my research paper. I just have to add my cites. And my next question is, because one of the reasons I do what I do is because I get to learn all these things and I don't have to do the research because other people do it. And so I say, great, what did you read? Tell me about it. And they'll say, well, I haven't read anything yet, but I wrote the paper. I just have to put in the citations. And I'll say, so the research writing process should involve you reading the ideas to come up with your own ideas. Oh, no. The assignment says I just have to include citations. So then they'll put in the citation. They want me to help them sort of just put in citations for things that they haven't read. And I know that's not how the teachers are teaching it. So can you talk maybe a little bit about, as you make these annotations, ways that this can make the process more visible for students, and also how it can help support that work that teachers are already doing instead of trying to do something different?
Yeah, well, we can certainly talk about that. So one of the key things that I found about PowerNotes is that since we're building a process from kind of beginning to end, so as soon as you capture and read your research sources, I'm going to share my screen real quick again. You can do a lot of different things to prompt yourself to capture information. So if you're doing things like teaching students how to just do a rhetorical analysis before they even start to start their writing, you can kind of format that using our topics. So I showed kind of just like basic topics here. Oh, sorry, one second. Just kind of your basic topical structure, very easy for you to add topics on the fly. So if you're doing your actual research assignment, you can add new things on the fly whenever you want to, add new categories, drop things into them. But the whole point is we want to start students thinking a lot more about how what they're reading about ties to their eventual goal. But also for professors, we want them to be able to assign topics ahead of time and really allow them to, for instance, use rubrics to point out what they should be looking for in these articles, prompt them through their reading process, help them identify these things so that they can do more complex analyses with them later on. In terms of visibility, the whole point is, you're going to be, during your research process, gathering information, organizing it, annotating it, and then once you've captured a good amount of information, you can then go to what we call the project outline. You can access the project outline here by clicking on the project outline link in the sidebar. That'll take you to our web app. This is all of I gathered some content for a different project here. And here's where the students are going to see all of the information that they've gathered for all of their sources. And here's where they can then reorganize information. They can just drag and drop things around to reorganize. And we wanted also for them to take little steps to get closer to that end paper. And so they can add their own thoughts. They can add topic sentences. These are all kind of things that normally they'd have to take big leaps to do, going in between some of these steps. And so we wanted to kind of break that down, put it into a structure and a user interface that made everything much easier, particularly from a reorganization standpoint. And then, as you mentioned, then you can then have several export options. You can download to that Word document that you mentioned. This is, the beginnings of an outline, and they can get more complex they can get more sophisticated with their outline. So they're getting a lot closer to writing. Another thing that we just built this spring with respect to visibility, we really wanted to get, and we've been working with schools that are partner schools, to really give their instructors, whether they're in the classroom or in a writing center, a lot more visibility earlier on in their research and writing process. And I'm going to just quickly show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go to a kind of a side-by-side view here with our sharing feature. So this is a new feature. A student can now share their project with any number of people, their professor, a tutor in the writing studio, a peer if they're doing peer review. Once it's shared, the person they share it with will get this view. It's pretty much the identical view, has all the same information. There's a banner at the top showing them that it's not their project, that they can view, comment on, and download it, but they won't be able to edit it. The whole point here is you'll be able to add comments at any point in time. So I'll add a comment here. And it pushes real time. So this can be used for asynchronous or synchronous feedback. So you can see here, I get that right away. As the user, I can comment back. And as soon as I do that, again, it pushes here. A lot of schools want to use this for in-class peer review, as well as just giving feedback from any number of reviewers. You can also do things like sort by topic, sort by date, sort by source. You can quickly see what are all the dates the student did their work? How much did they do? I'm going to jump into a particular day, see what they did that day, and then jump into a particular source. You can view all their sources, jump into a particular source, see what they did for that source. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to work on to give even more visibility than just that Word download to the people that need to review this work, so they can give that earlier feedback. And that's something Carolyn's going to talk about later in the presentation.
Thanks, Wilson. As you're showing that, and I hadn't, as you know, I hadn't seen fully the share feature yet. So that was really exciting. It's like a moving annotated bibliography.
Yeah.
And because I feel like when I was in the classroom and I would always assign an annotated bibliography as a way of helping students move through that process. But there was this waiting time sort of as I worked through those, and we talked about both the content and the formatting. But it also reminds me when I first started using Google Docs with students, I would get these updates in the middle of the night that a student had resolved a comment. And I said, oh, wow, their work, you have this idea, it's all invisible. It's not only invisible to them, it's invisible to us, right? Yep. Sometimes. So that's really neat. So one other area I sort of want to talk about, and then I really want to get to Carolyn and Leah, but a big concern, and it seems like every year I hear more and more people are concerned about academic integrity, and in particular around plagiarism. I tend to align with the idea that plagiarism is just the sign of a bad assignment, but of course that's because the process, a good assignment is going to build that process in. But there have been, as we move to online, more and more virtual learning, especially in the age of COVID, there seems to be even an increased, almost a race to try to find ways to sort of catch students. And I put catch in quotation marks. One of the things I like about this is that it doesn't seem to be trying to police or discipline or catch students after the fact, but it sort of attaches those citations in the process. It facilitates students bringing those citations in. You haven't talked a lot about how the citations actually work or how they're checked or how that process works. Can you share some of that?
Yeah. So what we're really trying to focus on is not trying to catch students that are, may or may not be trying to plagiarize either accidentally or on purpose. Instead, what we're trying to do is build a framework where they're going to be kind of prevented from doing it in the first place. So we're doing that through both, features, specifically, for instance, every time you highlight something with PowerNotes, we're automatically going to grab the URL. What we found is that the vast majority of students that end up getting caught for plagiarism aren't trying to steal ideas. Instead, their research process is undisciplined, so they're not grabbing URLs and citation information when they're on the source. Like you mentioned earlier, they're doing it all at the end of the process. When they've done their paper, then they try to go back and find all the citations. That's when they can get in trouble if they can't find that source. So that can't happen with PowerNotes. So as soon as you highlight something with PowerNotes, in addition to grabbing the URL automatically, so you can just come back to this whenever you want, just by clicking on this URL, on everything on the open web, we're going to grab the citation information too. So this is all in the metadata on the website, everything you need to create a citation. So that's going to get pulled automatically just by you highlighting something. Again, you can copy and paste all this information, but it's kind of a distracting task that takes time and prevents you from reading things thoroughly. We let you edit this information, but the whole point is we're trying to take away a lot of those mechanical steps that if you don't do them, you can get in trouble later. But we're going to kind of handle that right up front. The other thing is with the visibility, it's going to be a lot harder to plagiarize even if you're trying to intentionally plagiarize. This is something you told me yesterday, where if you have that visibility as a professor into that outline and all their sources, it's going to be much more difficult for you to try to plagiarize something, because you as a professor can see how the outline and your paper progresses over time, so that when you get the end product, you kind of know how it went through the entire process.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really like. I've only rarely had students really intentionally try to plagiarize, and those are usually pretty easy to catch. But I like that here the focus is on the reading and the learning and finding where do you stand. Now you have all these ideas, where do you really stand, creating those spaces. Unless you have something else you want to show, Wilson, I'd really like to go to Carolyn right now and learn a little bit about how she's using it in her first year writing course.
Nope, I think we're good. We can always do more fulsome demos for anyone on the call. We're happy to do that, but I'd love to jump into how people are really using it, which is something that's always, we learn from. So it's great.
Great.
Okay, let me share my screen. I have some slides here. And as Brett indicated, I am from Sacramento State, which is part of the California State University system. I have taught for Los Rios Community College also, and mainly work in first year writing and our second year sophomore writing class. So I wanted to kind of talk about my history with PowerNotes and why I started using it, and then talk about some of the particulars of how I implemented this in my class and why I did. I think I had a very similar experience to Brett. Wilson came to our department meeting for our writing program at the beginning of, I think, fall 2017. And as I was listening to his presentation, I started to think, gosh, this would really help me with this particular assignment, or this would help my students do this thing. And so I really wanted to try it out, but fall semester was already underway. And so I ended up using it in the spring of 2019. While I was using it in my classroom that spring, I was also I had a grant to design an online course. And so as I was using it, I started to see the value for my online course and how that would allow me to do some of the things that some of the scaffolding that I used to do in paper would give my students a way to do that online and easily turn it into me for the online course. And so I think as I've used this over the past few years, I've found kind of more and more applications for what I'm doing. I want to talk also today about my advice for implementing and using this in the classroom, and then finally just kind of why it's been helpful and kind of where I'm going with this from here, as the whole California State University system will be online in the fall. And so I'm going to have to make much more use of this to help my students through the research process. So a few things. One, I think, is probably take time to practice using the program yourself. I think the more familiar you are with it, the easier it is to point your students and walk them through it. I think students who struggle with technology will probably also struggle here. But I think there are a lot of good videos that help them with it. And then the ones that tend not to struggle easily, I think, pick it up. The other thing I recommend is to have a clear purpose in mind for why you're using the technology so that you can communicate this to students. I think a lot of times when you're throwing new technology at them, sometimes it's overwhelming, and I try I like to use technology, but I like to use it so that it's valuable. And so I try to communicate to them why we're using PowerNotes and what they're going to get out of it. I think if students know what they're going to get out of it, then they'll try to use it, and then they end up really liking it. And most of my students have said, once they started using it, that they're then applying it to other courses where they're doing research and reading. So I think some of the things that I used as why are we doing this and what are our purposes is that I already was collecting notes from them in paper on their articles, but that was really ineffective, especially for my rhetorical analysis, where I was asking them to do so much in those notes that it was just cumbersome and messy and so forth. And so this is an easier, smoother way to do that. I also like about PowerNotes, and communicate this to my students, that instead of having, I don't know, 3 or 4 different sources with notes on them, PowerNotes collects all of that into one document or project, and then they can easily see the relationships between those sources. I recommend also having some kind of a practice assignment that just gives them credit just to use the program. That way they can develop their skills at using it. So then when it comes to the really important assignment that you want them to use it with, they already have skills and they're not spending so much time struggling with the technology. Some examples might be using PowerNotes to create a summary of a text that you're reading in class, or my English 20, which is my sophomore class, I had them collect notes to write a literature review first, and I didn't grade them on their PowerNotes. But then what I did grade them on was the rhetorical analysis that I had them using PowerNotes with. But the first opportunity was more low key so that they could get used to using the program. I think also just emphasizing the importance of watching the PowerNotes videos or reading the blog with the tips is helpful to get them used to the technology. And then I also created my own video discussing and demonstrating how we were using it for our specific assignment in class. And I think that's helpful also. In addition, I think making the PowerNotes required on some level in your class assignment is important, because if you don't require it, they will not use it. I think that they have enough to worry about, and willingly using a new technology is probably not high on their list of priorities. So I think requiring it on some level for the assignment will get them on board with using it. I graded it as a separate assignment. In one class, I think for the early practice assignment, I gave extra credit one time, and then other times I've actually required them to use it, but just done kind of a credit, no credit. The other thing, as you're using PowerNotes for a particular assignment, I would consider giving students a list of topics or maybe a template for topics that you think would be good for them to collect notes about. For my rhetorical analysis, this is particularly important because we read an article, talked about the rhetorical situation and terminology, and I wanted them to use that terminology and match it to what they were seeing in the documents that they were collecting samples from. I think it also is helpful for like with first year writing a research topic. Students may not understand what kinds of things to collect information on, and so some guidance about how to create the topics in PowerNotes I think is helpful. The share feature, which is a newer feature, is wonderful. I was so excited to hear about this feature, and I used it for the first time this spring. And I'll show you a sample of what I was able to do with that. And I think that is really valuable for us as instructors, because we, even though when I used PowerNotes previously on assignments, I had them turn those in and I could see their finished PowerNotes product. With the share feature, I was able to get in there earlier and head off some people that were on the wrong track. So I think a lot of times, I'm going to refer back to the rhetorical analysis assignment again, because that's a hard concept for them to grasp. They start analyzing the content rather than the rhetorical strategies. And so getting in there with the share feature allowed me to get people on task and on track for the assignment. And I think the same could be said with a research paper. If students aren't taking effective notes, then they may get off track for the paper. The other thing I think is important as you're using it is to consider how you'll grade the PowerNotes so that students know what to do or what to turn in. I'm going to show a rubric for my rhetorical analysis assignment that I used so that they knew exactly the minimum to do in the PowerNotes for me. And let me see. So this next slide, well, let me, I guess, kind of back up a minute. So I think those are really my main bits of advice for implementing this, orienting the students, having a clear structure for using PowerNotes and explaining to them what to do and why you're using it, I think are all helpful things. And then in terms of some of the things that I've been talking about, this is a screenshot of the shared PowerNotes project. You'll notice that this one is for my rhetorical analysis assignment. This student added in their own rhetorical strategies that they were going to look for in the documents that they were examining. I had students examine several documents and collect samples of the strategies. This one that I'm looking at is their collection of jargon strategies. I can see they have 7 different samples. Here is the student's analysis of this particular strategy that's working. And then here is the part of the text that they quoted to talk about the strategy. And then PowerNotes has automatically noted where that sample came from. And then I was able to go in and comment to help the student with their analysis And I just added a comment. One thing you could add to your analysis of the jargon is why the jargon is helpful or what it accomplishes for the writer and reader. And this allowed the student to extend their analysis and be more detailed. So I think the share feature is definitely a great added teaching tool for me. And then this particular slide shows my criteria for that assignment and my rubric, which I have on Canvas. And so I'm very specific about how many sources they need to gather materials from, how many rhetorical strategies they need to look at, and how many examples they need to pull from each of those documents. And so I think having a clear rubric is helpful for students. Before I had the clear rubric, I think I would have some students have very short PowerNotes and others have really extensive PowerNotes. And I think that still kind of happens a little bit, but at least I had some minimum standards for what I wanted them to do. And then the other thing I included here is just wording in my syllabus. And this looks kind of messy because I've cut this from 3 different pages of the syllabus. So I talked about technology we'd be using in class, and I included PowerNotes and a link to it so that they would be aware when the class began that they would have to learn something new. I talked about it as part of my grading policy since I was collecting the PowerNotes for one of the major assignments. And then it also appears in my schedule for when we're using that. So I think it's important to let them know up front that you are using that program. So if anybody, I guess, wants to bail on the class because they don't want to learn a new technology, they at least have been notified ahead of time. And I think for me, when I think about my fall semester that's going to be online, even though I've taught online before and I'm teaching online this summer, that class was specifically designed to be online and asynchronous, and I have PowerNotes embedded in that course and it works really well. I think as I move into fall, I need to think about my in-person courses. I think in the summer, I tend to have high-performing students and it's easier to get them on board with PowerNotes. In the fall, in what would have been an in-person class, oftentimes I would take the students to the lab and we practice with PowerNotes and things like that. And so I'll have to think of some more innovative ways to do PowerNotes in the fall, but I'm thinking that earlier short little assignments and readings will be helpful to get them oriented to it before we get to our research paper. So I think that was all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Leah next. So I'll stop sharing here.
Give me just one moment and I'm going to start sharing. All right, hi everyone, my name is Leah Bublitz. I'm the coordinator of the Reading and Writing Studio at Macomb Community College, and I'm going to talk specifically about implementing PowerNotes in one-on-one conferences, which I'm sure instructors are doing a lot of these days as we sort of help students to get online. So in this little portion of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the role of a writing center, particularly in the research writing process. I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences with PowerNotes because I use it in my own professional work. And I'll be talking about how I've used PowerNotes with both confident and developing writers with some success. So to begin with, when we think about the role of the Writing Center in the research process, our goal, while we obviously help students to conform to their instructors' expectations, we also work really hard on fostering student ownership of their process. particularly in developing a sense of confidence and competence in that learning process. When we're thinking about tech in the Writing Center, we focus on tools that promote, again, independence and confidence. And that's really important to us, that we're not introducing students to technology that's going to make them feel like this is one more thing that's hard for me to do. And so when we're working, when we're selecting technology, we're really careful about that. When I use PowerNotes, I have used it in my own research for pursuing evidence-based practice for the Writing Center. Oh, my camera's still not on. Well, I apologize for that. Oh, here we go. I'm sorry for that. I closed my window there. So I've used it when I'm pursuing evidence-based practice for the Writing Center, and I'm going to show you a little screenshot of a project that I've been working on. This summer, I started to research the process of developing asynchronous feedback for students, and then in March, we very quickly ramped it up. And so this is how I've used PowerNotes in that project particularly. And I'm going to change my share here for just one moment. So this is one of the articles that I was working with, and I just want to show you how this has helped me in my own organization. When we use PowerNotes, if we highlight something, it will pull up the project. And these are the things that I was thinking about when we started moving into asynchronous consultation with students. Accessibility, some of the challenges, problem-centered instruction, standardizing responses, assessment and training, and scheduling concerns. These were not necessarily things that I had in the front of my mind when I began the research process, but this is how I was able to organize my thoughts as I went. This is how the research process goes, as those of us who are students know. But this is also something that we need to teach to students, and this is how I have had a lot of success working with students in the reading and writing studios with PowerNotes. And we're going to go back to screen one again. Excuse me. All right. So when I have been working with introducing PowerNotes to students, these are the points of the research process that we've focused on. First of all, I've introduced this to students before they begin their research. And I found that PowerNotes encourages and empowers them to begin researching. Brett talked about this a little bit before. Sometimes students look at a research paper as, I need to write the paper, then I need to add the information. And that can be really intimidating if you're not sure what to write about. And so this has been helpful to students in seeing how they can develop their thought process as they go. I've found it really helpful with outlining and structure. I've highly encouraged students to use that outlining tool because, again, as you go and you learn things, you can use these notes that pop up in your mind to create an outline for that eventual document. And we've also talked about it when we're working on revision in terms of selecting and strengthening arguments. Sometimes it's a hard sell for students to say, well, you may not use every quote that's interesting to you as you write. And this is a great way for students to not feel like they're losing something. So, and I want to focus specifically on working with both confident and developing writers. Sometimes in the Writing Center, it can be a challenge to introduce new technology to writers who are still kind of getting the hang of writing in the first place, particularly students who are getting used to technology. But I really think this has been useful for us in students, even if they are not 100% comfortable with working online. And so when we're thinking about starting places, I found that PowerNotes has been helpful for confident writers because, once again, it reinforces that effective research writing process. That we begin with research, we collect our ideas, we make our notes, and from there, we decide what we write. For developing writers, I found this has been really helpful because it's a less intimidating way to begin to engage with the research. When students begin their research and say, I don't know what points I'm looking for, that can feel really difficult to begin to read articles. I found that PowerNotes helps students to just make notes of what's interesting as you read. It creates kind of a trail of breadcrumbs for them so that they can see that their reading hasn't been in vain. You can engage with this reading. Not everything that you read is going to be useful to you, but you can save it all and decide that later. I've also found PowerNotes to be really helpful in terms of helping students create knowledge. For confident writers, those tags that we use when we create notes in PowerNotes help them to name those connections across sources. This might even help them find connections they didn't realize they were seeing before. If I already have a category in my notes that says problem-based instruction, or a category in my notes that says, you know, benefits of fracking, or whatever it is we're writing about, it can be helpful to begin to categorize those things. For developing writers, as I mentioned a little bit before, I found PowerNotes confers value on their own thoughts and connections as they read. For developing writers, again, confidence can be a really big issue. And when you're asked to research, it feels like, man, I'm not supposed to include my own ideas here. I just need to use evidence from experts. And I've found that creating this trail in the way that PowerNotes allows you to do lets them see that what they thought about the reading as they read is important and can and should be used in that final document. We've also talked about this during this presentation as well, but I've found PowerNotes really helpful for students in keeping track of that knowledge. For confident writers, it really, again, helps them to classify, organize, and use the notes that they take. Sometimes annotation is in itself a daunting task, and I think this is a really great way for students to see that the notes that you take, the thoughts that you have, we can use them all together, and this tool helps make that connection. Again, for developing writers, it promotes those habits of annotation while reading, which is something it took me as a student a very long time to get in the habit of. That learning from reading doesn't just mean reading, it means writing. And PowerNotes is a really great way to help students develop those habits of annotation as they read. So they're gaining knowledge from what they read, but that knowledge is something that can be used. Finally, this is, I think, is the greatest advantage that I've found using PowerNotes one-on-one with students, is that it gives students something to show for the reading that they've done. For confident writers, it allows them to create a usable outline on which they can build. I've worked with students in PowerNotes through the process and find that sometimes they just want to use it for the initial read, and later on they'll use the outline they created in PowerNotes in another document. It doesn't always take them to the end, but it gives them a very, very useful jump start on that learning, even if they don't use all of the features in the end. For developing writers, again, it makes visible their engagement with the text. This means that texts and reading and knowledge aren't something that kind of floats around in our brains until we're ready to sort of get a butterfly net and hook it down. This gives them something to show for the reading that they've done, so that when they sit down to figure out what they want to write, they've got ideas to pull from right in front of them. Based on the work that I've been doing in our reading and writing studio with students, these would be my recommendations for using PowerNotes one-on-one in consultations. First of all, and I think every person has talked about this so far, empower staff who work directly with students to use PowerNotes on their own. This is why I'm able to use it effectively with students, because it was a great tool for me in my own professional work. And I can give that information to students and talk about my own experience and show them what I have done and how I've actually used it for the work I do. Particularly for developing writers, I recommend mentoring students as they become familiar with the program. Like any technology, it doesn't necessarily stand on its own as a learning tool. We want to be there to help students figure out how to use it, figure out how it can work for them. And one thing that I've seen really effective with the students I've worked with is when introducing the research process, introduce PowerNotes concurrently. If the research process is tied up in this idea that as we read, we take notes, we classify things, we put it together in this way, I found that to be a really effective strategy. All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Brett.
Thank you, Leah. I'm going to open it up to some questions, and we do have a question here in the chat. I realized earlier that I should have said, for full disclosure, none of us who are not working for PowerNotes are getting paid for this discussion. But the features that Leah really has highlighted, helping students to make that reading part of their process, I think, and making that visible, just seem to have a real advantage, at least for the students that we work with. Leah, Judy Chu asks you, do many MCC students come into the Writing Center already having some practice with PowerNotes, or does your staff introduce it to them in one-on-one consultations? So essentially, how widespread is PowerNotes being used at MCC at this point?
Okay.
That one's
well,
tricky.
So we've only had access to PowerNotes since December 2019. And while we have, Brett, who's our director, has emailed students, emailed instructors, basically as much of our community as we could reach, that they have access to PowerNotes and they can use it. When I've used it with students, I have been introducing it to them. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So maybe you can tell me, I've only worked with a couple of students. I don't do as many consultations as you do, but my students tended to be pretty surprised that they could take notes on a website and then keep those notes with them. There seemed to be a little bit of shock and awe that happened in their first introduction. And then they would say, well, when I get home, will I still have these? Yes. Yes, you will still have it when you get home, and you can print it and work with it. And I know Wilson didn't show this earlier, but he sort of alluded to it. Rather than exporting into a document, one can also export into an Excel spreadsheet, which I know for our nursing students, some of them do literature. They're like annotated bibliographies, but they're Excel spreadsheets, and that affords that. There's a question here as well. We've got we're getting hot. We're getting hot and live. Okay. How have faculty in other disciplines beyond English responded to PowerNotes? And I think I just mentioned nursing, but I think some other people here might be able to speak to that better.
Yes, so this is Wilson again. So we've had faculty in all different disciplines start using PowerNotes. Nursing obviously is one of them. We have several schools that are big users in their nursing departments. Something that we've recently started seeing a lot of is education departments, graduate studies in education, particularly schools that teach future professors how to use education technology. We've been in a lot of those departments. Pretty much any department that uses, that does a lot of research and writing. We started out in law schools, in grad schools, so obviously law, pre-law type majors, government, history, those types of things, PowerNotes is very useful for. We tend to focus on first year writing just because that's a great launching point in any school to kind of get a broad user base in the students. And then, once they get used to it their freshman year, then they move up and they continue using it. So PowerNotes is not that old. We've only been around since 2017. So we're continuing to find new and different ways to launch it in schools.
And I think that institutional launch, Wilson, is tricky. I know at Macomb, we purchased it in December, we got it onto the computers in February, and then we left for COVID. That was sort of our process. There's a question here: how does PowerNotes offer citations or support citations beyond MLA format? So in what ways would you see this transferring to, say, APA or Chicago?
So we're not tied to any specific format. We're format agnostic. What we do is grab citation information from websites on the open web, and we still leave it up to the students to format it. So whether it's they're using APA, MLA, doesn't matter to us, or if they're using Zotero or RefWorks or whatever, that's up to them. We're going to be doing a lot more later this year in terms of formatting. We're going to be probably integrating with some of those other tools so that students can format their citations with PowerNotes, or not with PowerNotes, but more easily through PowerNotes. We do an export to an RIS file, which mostly just grad students use. Like undergraduates and community college students don't want to deal with that. But we're going to be doing a lot more in the future with specific format, citation formats.
And then can PowerNotes only be used for websites, or can it be used for database articles? And what's that process?
Yeah, so it works on theoretically anything. So it should work on almost everything on the open web. We actually integrate with your library and their proxy server, so it'll work on all of your academic databases. It'll work on any PDF online or on your computer. It'll work on your LMS. It'll work on the vast majority of your e-textbook platforms. We just launched a feature this week where you can now import images and screenshots into and annotate them and incorporate them into your outlines. The end goal, and we're not there yet, is to be able to incorporate anything into PowerNotes, any sort of research source, whether it be text, visual, audio, whatever it is, integrate anything. We're not there yet. We handle most of the text right now, the vast majority of text, and we're just started doing images. We'll be doing video and audio over the next several months.
We have just a couple more minutes left, everyone, but there are a couple questions here. The one I want to say, Wilson, I know you just said that you added the ability to annotate images.
Yep.
I know that was big for us. I know that we are among the people who asked you to change that because you were competing with some other much more expensive items that could do that. And so I was happy to see that addition. One of my colleagues is asking what's the easiest way for faculty, at least at Macomb, to access PowerNotes from Canvas. I could speak to Macomb and say that we have this information up in the Reading and Writing Studios page. I'm not sure if it's up in the Faculty Center, but we can probably make it happen that way. And anyone who uses a macomb.edu email has free access. So students, staff, anyone. But maybe it's also helpful, Wilson, I was able to use PowerNotes through a conference promotion to try it out to see if it worked. And I was able to use it with a couple of students to get a sense of it. What would be the steps for people to find you?
Yeah, so I think one of the keys is to just reach out to us. I think Jimmy can post all our email addresses in the chat here. We can schedule a demo because we really only hit on the very tip of the iceberg in terms of features. But we're more than happy to give any faculty or administrators free access to PowerNotes. Anyone that signs up, just go to powernotes.com. If you sign up, you'll get one free project that you can play around with. And that'll give you an idea, but I think doing something a little more formal, we do pilots all the time, stuff like that, to get you using PowerNotes in more real life situations, I think would be helpful for you to understand how it can benefit your students and your faculty.
Well, I could speak as a former very frustrated student and someone who continues to do writing on my own and is still overwhelmed by the process. I have found this to be a helpful scaffold for myself. I love the idea that it will integrate with Zotero because that is my other most favorite free technology out there. Brett, was it a hard sell to MCC to get them to buy into it? So I'm going to cheat on that answer entirely, Judy, because I was fortunate as the director of the Reading and Writing Studios to have had some private donations that were made to facilitate students. And so I purchased it because I wanted my staff to be able to use it. And the plan was to, we brought faculty in for some additional or initial demos of it. And then we were beginning to, the process of offering more campus-wide faculty orientation. Those conversations were in February and March, and then we all left campus to avoid the virus. So we were sort of caught right in the middle of that conversation. But our tutors have been really excited to use it, especially because for us, it is at least a weekly experience that students are crying in the Writing Center, students who are trying really hard to balance raising families and working jobs and taking classes. And they believe that they read the article, but then they spend 45 minutes of their session trying to find the article. It was out there somewhere. It's on the Google and they're trying to find it. And they have these notes they took in the margins of a notebook, but they can't find that page. And we spend 45 minutes trying to find the work they did rather than talking about the work they're really trying to do. And so for us, having a place where we say, great, here, it's all going to be collected here and it's on the cloud, so you're going to be able to find it somewhere else. That spoke volumes. It's really, rather than managing students' frustration, which is an important part of what all of us do, we're helping students to get back to the work of learning and being students and doing what they're really there to do.
Thank you so much, Brett, Wilson, Carolyn and Leah, really appreciate it. Our time is now towards the end here, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop engaging. This recording will be shared with everyone who registered for today's session, even those who are unable to attend. And also I want to just highlight two things here that I put in the chat. If you have any questions, Jimmy put some of the emails of the PowerNotes staff who are on today's conference call in the chat. Feel free to reach out to them if you didn't grab that or are unable to now. You can always reach out to whoever you received this information, including myself. And then also, I put a link into the agreements. So for any licensing questions as well, reach out to Jimmy and some of the others as well, or you can always reach out to me for some of those questions, and I'll make sure to point you in the right direction. But with that, appreciate everyone on the call, and thank you so much for your time and participating today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
On
you,
behalf of
Carl.
PowerNotes, thank you all.